We have a really special guest today, a really special presentation. And before I introduce her, I'd like to give you some information about next week's Arts in Medicine. We have a special presentation by Stephen Cole Hughes from Stories on Stage. So we will have a dramatic reading. Stephen will be reading a short story by Lydia Millett called Sir Henry. It's about a dog walker. So if you're interested in dogs and dog walking and you want to hear a really beautiful story read by a professional actor, please come back next Monday. So our presentation today, Women Artists of the 18th Century, is brought to us by actually a new speaker for Arts and Medicine, Molly Medakovich. And Molly is an art historian and museum educator. Since 2012, she has been a master teacher of European American and Western American art at the Denver Art Museum. Her role centers on connecting visitors with art through exhibition development, tours of the collection, and hands-on gallery activities. She's also an affiliate faculty member in the University of Denver's Department of Art and Art History, and she teaches courses on 18th and 19th century art. She's offered classes both in the classroom and online at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she received her PhD. Her scholarship focuses on women artists, gender and representation, and the city of Paris as a capital of art in the early modern period. So please welcome Molly.
Thank you so much, Tess, and thanks for having me. This is a really great space, and I hear fantastic things about this lunchtime series. So it's a lot of fun for me to get away from my desk over at the museum and to have a little bit of a change of pace midday on this gorgeous day. So I'm going to wear my art history hat rather than my museum educator hat and present to you today one of the subjects that is near and dear to my scholarly heart, and also personally I find this history of women artists fascinating, and during a period, the 18th century in France, of enlightenment and of major changes happening in French society, and where women were at during this period, and what the experience of being a woman and being an artist meant. These discourses of gender, of sensibility that kind of forced women in a way who wanted to be professional artists to navigate a very difficult path at times. So I want to start with this work that I chose for the promotional poster. This is a self-portrait by Adelaide Labiguillard from 1785. She pictures herself as an artist at work. She's in her studio. We can see her with her tools of her trade in hand, her easel here, and she's actively in the process of putting paint on her brush and is about ready to paint this very large scale canvas, which we can't see. So we're not sure what she's painting, but we can see that it's a very ambitious scale. She's holding also this stick that is on her lap. This is called a mahl stick, M-A-H-L, stick. And this is an implement that an artist would use. They would balance it, pretend this is the mahl stick, against the canvas upon which their hand would rest so that they could do highly detailed work with the paintbrush. And so when you see this work in person, you can see evidence of her artistic technique and the necessity to use one of these tools, the mahl stick. The style of her painting is very exacting. It's very finished. She masters textures and materials. Check out this fabulous dress, another one of these details that a slide can never do justice to. She gets the richness and the sheen just perfectly through this exacting brushstroke, through using that mahl stick to control it, to create this gorgeous and very feminine pale blue, silky, satiny fabric. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever painted. I can't say I'm an artist, I'm an art historian, but I can only imagine the mess that this kind of activity creates. So can you imagine showing up to your easel and actually painting in this kind of an outfit? A little unrealistic, maybe even outlandish if you're looking at this and just thinking about it with a passing glance. Similarly, her hat is one of these utmost fashionable hats of the period that a woman of means would wear and a woman of great fashion sense. It is this beautiful straw hat that's adorned with ribbons as well as the typical ostrich feather plumage that decorated a lot of ladies' hats during this period. So again, she's showing herself as a fashionable woman of the time and in clothing that she wouldn't necessarily have actually worked in. So it's the working artist alongside this image of beauty. And scholars have also compared this image of her to contemporary fashion plates. So again, suggesting this idea that she wants to present herself as both an artist and as a great beauty. And a great beauty she was known. And she's also bearing a little bit of cleavage, so we see she's very confident in her femininity as she gazes at us quite directly from behind her canvas. Now, behind her are two of her students. By 1783, l'Abbé Guillard had her own studio and had 9 female pupils in her studio that she was actively teaching. She was a woman artist during this period who championed the place of women in the arts. This was a period when the official institution where you would go to learn to paint, to draw, eventually, if you were a sculptor, to sculpt, only allowed 4 women through its doors. This was their academic rule, 4 women at a time, no more than that. So it was really a male institution. And so l'Abbé Guillard was one of the 4 women artists who became an academic painter during this period and specialized in portraiture. And so because of these limitations for women, she was really interested in doing what she could to support other women who were also passionate about becoming artists. Being in the academy was an easier way to gain a reputation, to exhibit your work at the biannual salon, where all academic artists and only academic artists could display their work. And so imagine at the salon of 1785 when she displays this work. In some ways, it's been talked about as getting other women artists through that door and putting them on display in the context of that particular salon exhibition. I love this painting in the way that the young students kind of gather around her. They're embracing each other almost. The one to our right, the one in the middle has her arm around the one to our right. And then you can see her hand is on the back of the chair. So there's this interesting linkage of the figures in the studio space. You can see in the shadows to the left of l'Abbé Guillard 2 sculptures. And these are interesting little details that she included. We have one male figure present in her studio space, and this is through a portrait bust of her father, Claude Edmé Labille, who was a haberdasher in Paris. So he was someone who was involved in the fashion world. A haberdasher, you could go to buy buttons, laces, ribbons, and other accoutrements with which you would decorate and have your dress or other outfit or hat customized by a tailor. So this bust by Augustin Pajou includes a paternal element in the portrait. And so her father kind of looking down on her in this direct diagonal line from the background. And there's also, curiously enough, a statue by Jean-Antoine Houdon of a Vestal Virgin from the 1760s. Now, whether or not this piece was actually in her studio, I'm not sure. But it's interesting that she would include a sculpture, a statuette, of a figure from ancient Rome in the ancient cult of the Vestal Virgins, who committed themselves to virginity and who kept the fires of Vesta burning. So here again, next to her father, there's this other emblem, we might say, of virtue, of her own morality. So this image is interesting to me and to other scholars in the way that it combines all of these different attributes of her identity as a woman, as an artist, during this particular moment in time in French history and in the context of the art world. This quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau from his book Émile in 1762 crystallizes in some ways the challenges that women artists like Labille-Guiard faced during this period. Rousseau wrote that, quote, "A man can do well depending only upon himself and can brave public opinion, but a woman who has done well has only accomplished half her task, for what others think of her counts no less than what she is in fact." So this idea that women's reputations were on the line, and to actually be a woman working in the public sphere was something that wasn't necessarily the ideal for a woman of this period. So if you imagine an artist who is really in the public eye, she's exhibiting at the salon, she's working with patrons, this isn't your lady staying home with the children in the private sphere. So this idea of a woman's reputation plays out in really interesting ways, and we'll look at some other images of how this works. I brought in this painting by Johann Zaffany, the academicians of the Royal Academy from 1772. And this is a painting of a studio scene, an academic studio in the Royal Academy of London. This academy had been established in 1768, about 115 years after the French Royal Academy, in 20 years. And you can see in here what is largely a male space. You have men gathered round, all of the different members of the academy, and the basis of their art is really on the human body. So you would go to the academy, you'd be accepted, you would learn how to draw. And human anatomy was a really basic artistic fundamental as a skill to be able to master. So you can see in the back, artists would learn how to render the human form through sculptures, casts of antique sculptures, this ideal male and female body, and also through the live nude model in the studio. Now this is where it became tricky for women artists because you really shouldn't be looking at a nude body. This is seen as immoral, it's a threat to women's virtue, so they were not allowed to participate in these live studio sessions. So here you can see the models modeling here and all of the different men pontificating over what's happening here in the scene. And these two portraits above are actually the two female founding members. There were two, in fact, in the Royal Academy in London. Mary Mosier on the right and Angelica Kauffman on the left. Now they're here only in portrait format because, again, they're not supposed to be in the studio looking at the nude body. So they're here in spirit, if not in flesh. So that was one major limitation for women. Well, if I can't learn how to draw from the live model, that's immediately going to limit me to certain subjects. And so for the most exalted artists, the best career you could have would be to be a history painter. So that would be scenes from history, the Bible, literature, and other sources. It requires you to have an imagination, to be able to evoke, to understand, and to depict things that you've never seen before with your own eyes. You're extrapolating from the classical sources that you've read, or you're making sense of the biblical text you've been poring over. So it's a naturally intellectual exercise, and one that requires you to depict the human form in all sorts of different poses and motions and facial expressions. So again, if you're not getting access to classical education, which women weren't, and you didn't have access to that live model, which women didn't, you're not going to get to that higher rank. So within this hierarchy of genres, below that came portraiture. Below that was genre painting, or scenes of everyday life. And then you have, what's after that? Still life is at the very bottom, and landscape is just above still life. Still life in French is nature morte, or dead nature. So going from history painting to still life at the bottom, quite a range of different genres that women dabbled in various ways. I brought in this diagram from the Encyclopédie. It's a taxonomy of human knowledge. So this is the age of enlightenment. People, les philosophes, these thinkers of the age, are really categorizing human knowledge, human experience, science, medicine, and really trying to understand the world and man's place within it. So this taxonomy of knowledge divides in the Encyclopédie into memory or history, reason and philosophy in the middle, and then imagination and poetry on the very right. And I bring this in just because imagination, it's really, really hard to see, in fact impossible. Under imagination, there is a further kind of categorization of the various uses of imagination, the ends of imagination, and sculpture and painting are in this as well. And I bring that up because imagination and creativity were discussed and understood in gendered terms, but also in the context of sensationalist psychology that was on the rise in the wake of Locke in England and Condillac in France, who talked about this idea that we understand the world, that we perceive the world through these external stimuli. We're all made up of bundles of nerves and fibers, and it's when external stimuli meet us and we receive an impression from the external world. It can be a physical impression, it can be ultimately an emotional impression. And unfortunately for us ladies, we were thought to have way too much sensibility. So this was known as sensibilité. And so you start to see paintings of women fainting and women being moved to tears and this great emotionalism and sentiment in painting. And men are depicted this way as well. But in terms of this idea of perception, so we perceive things based on this organization of this reception of external stimuli. But what happens next is what makes men differ from women. So men who have firm nerves, strong physical form, they're capable of rationalism and logical thought. And it's also thought that men have just enough sensibilité, they receive just enough impression to be able to actually use that to their advantage as artists. And it impacts their imagination in a fruitful, creative way. Women, on the other hand, and this is why I did that loose squiggly around the ideas on the right side of the screen, women have less dense fibers. Our muscles, our nerves, our organs rapidly contract. I imagine this sort of fluttering business happening in our bodies. So this is a problem because we don't have that stability that men have, and so it means, we're less firm in our ideas. We're not really able to organize. We're kind of flighty in the way that thoughts come in and sort of flit around our heads. So if you're a woman, this is a problem. How are you going to come up with a painting? How are you going to come up with ideas in this visual form? What in the world will happen if your imagination gets too excited? And we certainly see images of this nature. So on the left is Marguerite Girard's The Bad News, and you can see a woman with a letter in her hand that she's received. Who knows if it's from a lover, if it's from a friend, but she's fainted because of this news. She's pallid, her skin has gone ashen, and her friend or her maidservant has a little vial, something she's sniffing to wake her up. On the right side, this is one image of many that picture the perils of reading and the danger of the novel when women are left to their own devices. Here she is in what is probably her boudoir, a private space that developed in the 18th century interior where women could go. Boudoir, boudet, means to pout. So it was a place where a lady, and I don't see a toilette, but it's one of these you typically see in boudoirs, but it's her own private space. A boudoir, maybe a cabinet, her own office. And you can see implements of learning. There's a globe, there are papers, I can't tell if that's a map, but she's been perhaps enjoying some intellectual activity. She's also got music on the left side of the canvas. But if you look at her right hand, there's an open book, and her fingers are kind of loosely nestled or fingering those pages, and her left hand is disappearing underneath her dress. So she's been whiling away the afternoon reading a novel, and it's gotten the best of her. And so there are images like this and others that are somewhat more suggestive of women in gardens with novels kind of thrown to the side, and the hand in the dress. So masturbation being one of these, oh my gosh, women have been left to their own devices. And the novel, as a really primary genre during this period, the threat of these love stories, these romantic interludes becoming a little bit more than ladies can handle. So I say all of that and I show these images because it relates in interesting ways to, again, the ability of women to be artists based in science, and this idea that in some ways anatomy is really destiny. The nerves are really destiny in the way that sensibilité has the ability, the potential to wreak havoc on a woman's body and on her brain. Here we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. While I respect him as an important philosophe and thinker of the Enlightenment, this is sort of generally what we're getting from this period and with this idea of sensibilité. He said that woman's imagination, more lively than constant, lends itself little to those true and picturesque expressions, which are the sublime of the imitative arts. More capable of sensing than of creating, she receives more easily in her mind the image of the objects that she cannot reproduce. So in this age of enlightenment, women are effectively being told, and it's understood, that they can't be these rational creatures that men are. And it makes its way into the arts through this kind of language and through this really loaded discourse. So you do see a lot of images of women pursuing creative activities, and this was known as, or we call this, the accomplishments. It's a fabulous thing if you know how to play the piano or the harpsichord, or if you can strum the strings of a harp, or if you're an amateur artist and can do something like draw. These were signs of a certain socioeconomic class and a certain mark of femininity that, of course, any man would recognize as very desirable hobbies of a woman to be done in the context of the privacy of your home, entertaining family and friends, and generally ladylike pursuit of these creative passions. Now, when women did attempt to participate in the public sphere in this context in England, this is Anne Damer, who was a sculptor, which was even rarer for a woman of the time to be doing that kind of manual work. Imagine sculpting a block of marble. And you can see here she's pictured in a similar dress to l'Abbé Guillard that we saw in the first slide. So still every inch the lady, but in this caricature, she's being poked fun of. Here's a classical sculpture of Apollo. This is the period when the Apollo Belvedere, an ancient sculpture, was really popular in the visual arts. And so we have her actually chiseling out her own Apollo, except the chisel is about to land in a very conspicuous part of the sculpture's body, in his buttocks. And her friend is assisting her, and coming from the front is a spear that's so strategically placed in this caricature. So you see kind of a public, this type of image is poking fun of the woman who has the ambitions to do something like sculpture in this very sarcastic way. Her chisel is up, ready, her mallet is up, ready to strike. So she's an artist at work, but to very different ends. And typically we also see women in visual culture during this period as mothers. And so this ideology of motherhood was the countering discourse to what the women artists were hoping to do at this time. So this painting by Jean-Baptiste Greuze, The Beloved Mother, is one of the strangest and one of my favorite works of art of the 18th century. A man is coming home. It's been speculated who he is or what he does. Some have identified him as a farmer. Others coming in from the city. And you can see he's related to that public life, external world with his store. He comes in, and behold the vision. His wife is being surrounded and nearly smothered by the gaggle of children that they've produced together. And this is a photograph. This is in a private collection, so I don't have, and I don't think I've seen an actual color photograph of this painting. But this is the original painting, and here is a pastel study for just her face, without all of these clamoring, clinging toddlers. They're all the same age. She's got to have about 10 two-year-olds, which sounds absolutely terrifying and exhausting at the same time. She's a busy lady. I'm not sure if that expression is one of exhaustion, pleasure. It's kind of hard to read. So we see these images of motherhood as being, in some ways, the ideal. And there's a great quote by Denis Diderot, I guess I included it, who wrote about this painting. He said, "This painting says to all men of feeling and sensibility, keep your family comfortable, give your wife as many children as you can, and be assured of a happy home." So family, home is where the heart is for a lot of these images. So we see a lot of happy mothers, happy couples. This is the era when the idea of the nuclear family arises and the sentimental bonds between husband and wife, moving away from arranged marriage. The idea that you should take care of your own kids and not send them to a wet nurse. So women had a new role during this period to be nurturing wives, loving mothers, and artists, in the context of all of this, wasn't exactly your norm. So L'Abbé Guillard, and I'll also bring in an image of, we'll have time, a couple of images by Vigée Lebrun, who was also one of the major women artists in the Academy at this time. What some of these bigger names, bigger artists of the period did would be to secure patronage from other powerful women. So L'Abbé Guillard did a lot of portraiture, but she got a great commission from the aunts of Louis XVI. And this is one of his aunts, it's Adelaide of France, and so the daughter of Louis XV, from 1787. And here she shows Adelaide as kind of this devoted daughter and member of the royal family. She has an effigy here, this kind of raised relief in the frame of her father, her mother, and her brother, who had all died. And there are up here these very dramatic, the deathbed scene of Louis XV. He had died of smallpox. And so she's showing herself in this guise of this state portrait as part of the royal family, part of that lineage. She never married or had kids, and in fact, in the very background between these two columns, kind of hard to see, you might see that little smoke puffing out. There's actually another statue of a Vestal Virgin. So these motifs, thank you, these motifs become used over and over again, not only for women artists to represent themselves, but also showing the virtue of other women in the context of portraiture. So this is a period when visual culture is not our Facebook, our YouTube, our Pinterest. So there are these stock symbols that are still really powerful in the message that they send to the viewer. Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun was perhaps an even more celebrated artist during her time. She was one of the 4 women artists accepted into the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris. I think the same day that L'Abbé Guillard was accepted into the Academy. And I brought this painting in, this iconic self-portrait, because it is, again, playing around, like we saw with L'Abbé Guillard's self-portrait with her students, playing around with different ideas. As this is how we interpret it art historically, of her as both a beautiful woman, for which she was known for her beauty. People talked over and over again about how beautiful this woman was. But also her role within the tradition and this idea of emulation. So if you're an academic artist, you see yourself in an artistic lineage. And it goes all the way back to the ancients. So as an art student, you are looking at ancient sculpture to learn how to draw, to create that ideal form. You're learning from the old masters. You're learning from your teacher, your instructor, your professor of art. And so for a lot of women who maybe were taught informally, who didn't have access to the academy, and even Vigée Lebrun initially studied informally in various artists' ateliers or studios, this idea of the lineage doesn't quite hold up for women artists in the same way. And so this particular painting, self-portrait by Vigée Lebrun, she had gone to the Netherlands around 1781, 1783, and had seen this particular painting on the left, Peter Paul Rubens' portrait of his second wife's sister, so his sister-in-law. It's called the straw hat. We're not sure why, because it's kind of a felted-looking hat, but this is the title. So Vigée Lebrun creates her own self-portrait in a straw hat, riffing off of this painting from the 17th century that she had seen firsthand when she was in the Netherlands. So you can see, looking at both of them, we've got these images of fashionability. We saw that with La Guillard, of femininity. Susanna London bears a little bit more than we see with Vigée Lebrun. But the emphasis on the textures of the different pieces of clothing that she wears, the fabulous hats with those ostrich feathers. And Vigée Lebrun has added a little flourish with some flowers on the brim of her hat. And here, instead of looking kind of to the side, and I don't know if this is the coy look by Reuben Sitter or not. It's another one of those tough-to-read expressions. Vigée Lebrun is looking directly at us. And so like we saw with La Guillard, who had that very confident gaze, here you have an artist gazing back at you again. And her mouth is slightly parted. And some scholars have talked about this as, this utterance. What could she be saying to us, this confidence that is coming through by virtue of that open mouth? I'm currently reading a book that just came, I don't know how recent it is, but it's about the history of the smile. And there's one of her self-portraits on the cover talking about the different meanings of the smile culturally and how they're depicted in art, because for pretty much the entire history of art, teeth were not supposed to be shown. It was seen as very gauche to have teeth, your pearly whites, flashing in a portrait. So here she is looking directly toward us, wearing these beautiful clothes. She's not in the act of painting, but she's holding the implements of her profession, so her palette and her brushes, and she's giving us this gesture. Not totally sure what that could mean, but it's this interaction with us as the viewer. So not only is she a beautiful woman, but she's also directly putting herself within this tradition. Rubens, during the 18th century, was highly popular and revered. And really the 17th century for 18th century artists was the bee's knees. This was where they looked to for inspiration. And Rubens was one of these figures that was very important to the period, and who Lebrun is really trying to ally herself in a strategic way, which is kind of an interesting strategy. She also had a powerful patroness, Marie Antoinette, and painted over 30 portraits of the Queen before the French Revolution broke out. So in 1789 to 1793, during the height of revolutionary activity, we know that Marie Antoinette met an unfortunate fate and ended up going to the guillotine, while Vigée Lebrun fled France and went into exile in Italy, Austria, Russia, and other European countries because she was associated with the royal household. But of course, she did great. She painted all of the portraits of the European and Russian nobility, made a fortune, and was eventually able to return to France in great state. So this portrait of Marie Antoinette and her children I brought in because it's this image of a powerful woman, but again within this dialogue of motherhood. And so during this period, 1787, as the French economy was tanking, as Marie Antoinette was met with increasing criticism, she was never quite accepted by the French. She was thought of as foreign because she was Austrian. And her role was really to birth the new kings of France, the children of France. And so around this time, you also have a scandal with Marie Antoinette where someone pretended to be her and said that they would purchase this beautiful diamond necklace from the royal jeweler. Well, it wasn't really Marie Antoinette, but this person who was pretending like they were Marie Antoinette ends up frauding the royal jeweler. And so everyone thinks Marie Antoinette, who's already terrible, has done another terrible thing during a period of economic difficulty. And so here she is in the context of the affair of the necklace and the impending revolution within 2 years, the storming of the Bastille, being pictured just in a room adjacent to the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. If you've been there, you might remember that little detail. And she's with her children. She's surrounded by her children. There is a jewelry box that was given to her and Louis XVI just before they became king and queen, but it is definitively shut. And she's also not wearing much jewelry. So she's got some pearl earrings and a pearl strand bracelet on her wrist. So very simplified. I mean, obviously she's still looking pretty fancy and pretty royal in this portrait. But this is one of these PR campaigns, visual PR campaigns, to put this up at the salon to kind of advocate for her more motherly, maternal aspects, and hopefully people would see her in a more sympathetic light. I want to show you a related image by Angelica Kaufman, who you saw her portrait in that image of the academic studio, one of the founding members of the Royal Academy in London. She was a history painter, which, again, was not the most common genre for women artists to be working in, and she looked at a lot of women from history. So she's working in this elevated genre, which could be seen by some as a bit of a transgression for a woman artist. But in this particular painting, Cornelia, Mother of the Gracchi, she's sticking again to these themes of motherhood. And she doesn't do this for every painting from history, but there's a link to the image we just saw of Marie Antoinette. Here you have in the middle of the painting Cornelia, a woman from ancient Republican Rome, and she's been visited by a friend or by a woman who's selling jewelry in her home on the right there in the red. And she's got an open jewelry box on her lap and is showing Cornelia and her children, her 3 children, a strand of some kind of necklace. Showing off her jewels and asks Cornelia, Cornelia, where are your jewels? And Cornelia, the wonderful mother that she is, points, and you can see her gesture to her children and says, my children are my most precious jewels. So it's this very kind of moralizing message, this exemplum virtutis, or example of virtue, from ancient history as a moralizing lesson about women's virtue and the important role of motherhood. And so a lot of scholars have tied this type of messaging to that image of Marie Antoinette with her children, the jewel box shut, very kind of barely adorned with those more modest, virtuous pearls, and pointing to them as her children and her important role as the mother of the future King of France. And Vigée Lebrun, too, depicted herself as a mother. She had 1 daughter, and a lot of the women artists, the more I think about it, that were really successful professionally didn't have kids. Many of them married, but a lot of them didn't have kids. And so Vigée Lebrun was one that did, and she had a single daughter and writes about her in her memoirs, a good amount of pages devoted to Julie. And she also shows herself as this model of affectionate motherhood, the sentimental model of motherhood, alongside other images of her as an artist. So the portrait becomes a point where an artist can show her identity. And for a woman, for Vigée Lebrun, we see it happening through this idea of emulation, looking at Rubens, but also through the softer side of her identity, of her life, through her daughter. And this tender embrace, I think it's a little more successful than Marie Antoinette's. We still see this kind of stiff state portrait happening with the way the figures interact with one another. But for Vigée Lebrun, this embrace, the arms linking around one another, Julie's arms embracing her mother's neck, the way their heads in the right side tilt kind of sympathetically in the same direction. There's a really sweet image of motherhood that she's promoting here and showing herself as part of this ideal of femininity. Other artists, such as Marguerite Gérard, were not in the Academy and did, I wouldn't say less ambitious, but certainly not history painting, but small-scale genre scenes. Marguerite Gérard was the sister-in-law of Jean-Honoré Fragonard, who was one of the most successful artists of the 18th century, painting in the Rococo style and painting a lot of kind of lovely garden, flirtatious outdoor scenes. But she lived with him in Paris. You know, while some artists would get, including Fragonard, they would actually live in the Louvre. So there were studios there and there were apartments there. So if you were a woman and you couldn't get into the academy, but you had connections, typically your husband, a brother-in-law, her sister was married to Fragonard, you could end up in the Louvre. So here's Marguerite Girard living in the Louvre, being exposed to 17th century Dutch painting. So someone like Gerard ter Borch, the letter from 1660. So she's surrounded by all of these artists and this artistic culture, surrounded by art, and she depicts a lot of these domestic interior scenes of women's lives. So women reading letters, the bad news that you saw toward the beginning of this presentation of a woman fainting, women and their maidservants. So kind of a woman's world is what becomes her prominent, predominant subject matter. So the first steps on the left, the kiss of innocence, there are all these really lovely, kind of sweet, and what were very popular genre scenes of the delights of motherhood, the delights of the innocence of childhood, and these sold like hotcakes on the market. And she really churned these out, never married, never had kids of her own, was able to support herself. Some rumor that at a certain point she was supporting Fragonard as well, but that's been unsubstantiated. But it becomes this pattern. So looking back to the 17th century, but creating these very lovely, intimate scenes of domestic life that were more about these ideals of feminine virtue and modesty, less ambitious in any kind of alternative message or idea that they were trying to communicate. And then finally, we also have artists like Anne Vallier-Costet, who was working. She was one of the 4 female academicians during this last half of the 18th century, working in still life as well, and really doing her best at a genre that, again, it's at the very bottom of this hierarchy. It's called dead nature. So here she is mastering this genre. And critics would talk about women like Vallier-Costet, like Labille-Guiard, and say she's painting like a man. The vigor, the force with which she executes on the canvas is like a man. So even in the criticism, there's this interesting gendering of what does it look like to paint like a man? What does it look like to paint like a woman? And people fleshing this out in the way that they're talking about the art that's on view. We will have one of Vallier-Costet's beautiful, she did flower painting as well, beautiful flower paintings, bouquets, in an exhibition we're doing this July at the Denver Art Museum. It's 60 bouquets across about 150 years. And so men and women, but this is another one of her kind of mastery, moments of mastery where she's able to, with her paintbrush, just in amazing precision of detail, articulate and master the anatomy of the flower. So none less intellectual than a history painting in terms of the skill and the necessary tools with which to depict something in such amazing detail and such illusionistic likeness. So this is kind of the broad spectrum. Women were living within this period when the Enlightenment discourse was positioning them in a pretty tricky place. The expectation that their role was to be this virtuous and modest mother and wife, and these women who kind of come through in interesting ways as artists and push back in very subtle ways this prominent discourse that is limiting, but do so in some pretty fantastic ways. And this is really the tip of the iceberg. And in terms of scholarship, we're still in a period where we're kind of recovering. So in the 70s, art historians were interested in, well, what about the women artists? We have so many men artists that we study in museums, in our survey books. What about the women? And so it was a slow process of actually figuring out who were these women, and then applying and thinking more critically about the dynamics of the period and how women were navigating that. But we're still in a period when we don't have a handle or information on all of these fabulous artists. So it's still an ongoing project, but one that I find fascinating and relevant even today in terms of just sort of how thinking evolves and how kind of how these ideas are so entrenched. I mean, even thinking back 60 years ago and how some of these ideas, I think, were still part of, you know, this domestic ideal and women staying home, and we're kind of seeing seeing the pendulum swing in interesting ways with each generation. And so it's interesting to see how nuggets of this sort of pulse through different eras and different ideas. So I'd love to answer any questions. This was kind of a speedy tour through women artists of the 18th century, but questions, comments, thoughts? Oh, thank you.
If you do have questions or comments, please hold down the button and speak into the microphone.
So you commented on how one of the artists escaped because of association with the royal family. Were artists killed who were associated with royalty in France?
Some were. I can't think of any major names that would stand out, but certainly, unless, there's an artist, Jacques-Louis David, who barely escaped the guillotine, and he was an artist who was a revolutionary, and then as political climates changed, he would sort of adapt with them. So he goes on to, he starts doing revolutionary festivals in Paris and painting the martyrs of the revolution who were really fighting for the cause and anti-monarchical. Then when Napoleon comes around, he's painting for Napoleon. And so there's this kind of survival thing going on. So he was close, but certainly I'm sure others didn't make it.
And were Marie Antoinette's children killed?
They were. I feel like one of them might have died while they were in prison awaiting the guillotine. I don't think they were killed.
Were these paintings, I don't know if it's on, were these paintings that you showed us today, were these done for commercial purposes or for personal purposes? And how would female commercial art have sold relative to male commercial art at the time?
So for an artist in the academy, you would typically have a patron. So even an image, a painting like Vigée Lebrun's Marie Antoinette would be commissioned by the Queen. It would be shown in the salon, so there would be public access to it. It was a period when the public encountered art more frequently because of the salon. So there was kind of an openness in that sense. The idea of selling your art was thought of as a little bit uncouth. So if you were an artist working in the academy, it wasn't as if someone who came to the salon would say, I want that painting for, 500 francs, whatever the currency was at that time. But it would be an advertisement for the artist. So if I go to the salon and I see that fabulous portrait by L'Abbé Guillard, oh my gosh, the dresses I have at home in my closet, I would love her to paint me in all of my, fashionable glory. So I could approach her. And so it wasn't a direct advertisement, and in fact it was thought to be very uncouth to even talk about money in the context of the salon and the academy. And Vigée Lebrun was actually, there was resistance of her being admitted to the academy in part because her husband was the owner of a gallery in Paris. And they thought, oh, there's going to be a conflict of interest, and even talking about money and fine art, there's something kind of dirty about that. So it was definitely, but obviously these artists had to sell their work, and it was their livelihood. So it was kind of my understanding, a more of a subtlety in terms of how that interaction occurred. And having a studio where people could come and sit for you and becoming known on the market in that way. And there were also different galleries around town. And I can't think if these artists, off the top of my head, would have exhibited there as well, or if there would, if you're in the academy, if you're just in the academy or not. And there are also alternative venues. So the Salon de la Correspondance was one where a lot of women would show their work. And there's also the Academy of St. Luke, which was an alternative educational academy for people as well. So there were these other networks at play as well, beyond just the academy and that salon. Yeah.
Do you know what the process was for being selected for these academies? Did these women have champions?
I think in some ways they were connected, and in order to actually get in the door, anyone who wanted to become an academician had to go through a couple of different hoops. You would have two different stages of membership. So initially you would be taking drawing lessons in the studio of an academic artist. So you would have to have some kind of a connection or an in to that. And then you would become agrégé, which is kind of, I think of it as like you're becoming an assistant professor. And then you would have to show a reception piece, which would determine what genre of painting you would work in. So Vigée Lebrun actually presented an allegorical work, which would have made her a history painter, but she ended up not being a history painter. But once you show that, then you would end up becoming received, or reçu. So it's like being a tenured professor. And so initially, I'm guessing that there would have been those necessary connections, have any kind of entree into that world. And then once women were kind of in this world, people like Labille-Guiard, Vigée Lebrun would have different women like Marie Antoinette really championing for them. It was Marie Antoinette who essentially demanded that Labille-Guiard be admitted into the academy. She had a protectress in that figure of Marie Antoinette. Oh. Yes.
The Impressionists were a reaction, essentially, to this sort of orthodoxy. And it's interesting that you're trying to be orthodox enough to be accepted, and yet that stifles creativity, essentially.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of bind. And even so, the Impressionists take a totally new direction with art in the 19th century, the second half. And for women as well, we still see subject matter kind of restricted. So they're not taking their portable painting gear out on plein air, because you really need to be chaperoned. You're not going to roam around Paris on your own with all of your painting gear. So we still see a lot of domestic scenes, mothers and children. So it's kind of interesting what continues, but then what the ruptures are as well in terms of how people are painting and going away from the academic model.
Well, women weren't allowed to run the Boston Marathon in the 60s.
It's so hard. I mean, this is the thing that I was alluding to at the end, these threads that continued well into our own time and our own era. It's so hard to believe. And I think even for people today, younger generation thinking, oh, all the work's done. And it isn't. There are still some of these things that are percolating and that are still, in subtle ways and not so subtle ways, part of our cultural landscape. So it's interesting to see that evolution and change, but also some of the continuity. Oh.
I was just going to ask you, you said that one of the ladies had a memoir. She wrote, yes, and I was just wondering, I guess it was very difficult to paint those motherly paintings with all of those children, because it's very difficult to take a photograph of the family with children, and I cannot imagine how long did it take to paint the picture, to paint the painting like that?
That's a really good question. I've never thought about that before. Of all the times I've looked at those, it's a good question. I mean, for a sitting, for any kind of portrait commission, you might have several sittings with the people who are going to be in the portrait, or execute different sketches that could then guide your final composition. But to be able to achieve a real likeness, that would be a very big challenge with kids.
That painting with 10, 2 years olds, I cannot imagine how she did that.
Well, that one was a genre painting, but the artist still would have had to look, I'm assuming, at some kind of a human model to be able to paint that. But I cannot answer that question, but I love it. It's such a good question. Kids are everywhere when they're that age.
Thank you so much, Molly. We hope to have you back now that you've come and presented for us. It was just terrific. So thanks a lot.
Thanks. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Very nice.